Hello, welcome to Shelf Life, presented by the Virginia Festival of the Book. I'm Sarah Lawson, Associate Director of the Virginia Center for the Book, a program of Virginia Humanities. Thanks for joining us. A couple notes before I hand the program over to our speakers. First, please share your questions using the Q&A tab on Zoom throughout the event. Also, this event has optional closed captioning, which you can turn on and customize at the bottom of your Zoom window at any time. If you haven't already read today's book, we hope you will. For details about how to buy it from a local bookseller or check on a copy from your library, visit vabook.org, where you can also watch our past events. While you're there, please consider making a donation to support the festival's ongoing work at vabook.org/give. Also, we appreciate the support of our community partners for this event, Charlottesville Pride Community Network, Side by Side Virginia, and the UVA LGBT Committee for Faculty and Staff. To learn more about their work, visit vabook.org. Now, I'm pleased to introduce today's speakers. Trung Le Nguyen, author of The Magic Fish, is a comic book artist and illustrator working out of Minnesota. He received his BA from Hamline University in 2012, majoring in studio art with a concentration in oil painting and minoring in art history. He's contributed artwork for Oni Press, Boom Studios, Limerence Press, and more. Welcome, Trung. Joining him is Whitney Leopard, the senior editor at Random House Graphic. She has been editing comics for nearly a decade with notable titles like Lumberjanes, Adventure Time, and R.L. Stine's Just Beyond series. Whitney, Trung, thank you for joining us today, and please tell us more about The Magic Fish.
Yeah, thank you for having us. We are definitely excited. Hi, everyone. I'm going to kick off things by sharing with you about this amazing graphic novel. We all know that real life isn't a fairy tale, but Tien still enjoys reading his favorite stories with his parents from books that he borrows from the local library. It's hard enough trying to communicate with your parents as a kid, but for Tien, he doesn't even have the right words because his parents are struggling with their English. Is there a Vietnamese word for what he's going through? Is there a way to tell them that he's gay? This is The Magic Fish, the beautifully illustrated story by Trung Le Nguyen that follows a young boy as he tries to navigate life through fairy tales. The Magic Fish tackles tough subjects in a way that is accessible to readers of all ages and teaches us that no matter what, we can all have our own happy endings. And Trung, it is always a pleasure to see you.
Yes, it's lovely to see your face, Whitney.
But you know, it's been almost a year since The Magic Fish almost came out, and I would love to know how you're feeling. Have you revisited it since it's come out? Have you reread it recently? Anything like that?
Yeah, I read it for the first time in its entirety just a couple of weeks ago. It was such a long process, kind of writing and then, drafting and then drawing the book, that I didn't really feel the need to revisit it. And I have this sense of like, if I finish a project, I'm going to be really tempted to go back into editorial mode if I were to read it too soon. So I put it away and I didn't look at it and sort of just let other people give me feedback. And I was like, okay, great. This is out in the world now. I don't need to read it just yet. And so I think almost a full cycle of a year went by before I was like, okay, I think I'm ready to take a look at this book, because then I don't have that impulse to like, oh, I would do things differently. And I don't remember why I made certain choices on certain pages. And so I can enjoy the book kind of as it's meant to be presented. And wow, I was really, there were some parts of it that surprised me. Like I kind of remember drawing them and I remember writing them, but kind of seeing everything come together as like a final product after so much time away from it was still really surprising. And I forgot how heavy it got.
Okay, my real question, did you cry?
I did.
Because I feel like that's the one thing that people tweet at you constantly is like, Trung made me cry today because I read The Magic Fish. And I could say that like the amount of times that I like teared up, and I'm like editing this thing. So I'm reading it like, 20, 30, 50 times. And every time I would just be like, especially by the time you get to the end with the scene with the mother and all that, I'm sitting here just being like it just grabbed me in the heart. And so I was curious about like, now that you've revisited, are you getting the same reaction? Like, do you understand why people like both love and hate you for like making it?
Yes, I get it now. I finally understand.
Well, it's I'm glad that you've gotten a chance to revisit it in its like finality. But let's talk about The Magic Fish's origins. Where did the story come from and kind of what led you to the idea of this graphic novel?
Okay, so The Magic Fish is my very first long form narrative anything. I've never written anything before I wrote this book. So I'm honestly really shocked that things came together really well. Thank you so much for being a wonderful editor and helping me pull together all of the pieces. Um, a few years ago, I decided I want to tell long form stories because I love a thick volume. I love books. And I have such strong sentimental feelings about books that this is a thing that I wanted to make. And I was kind of bopping around in comics, and I love the format and I love the ways that the pages kind of felt when I read through them. I love libraries. And so I was like, I want to make like a book that can sit on a shelf that a librarian can recommend to a kid. And I have always loved fairy tales. And like the main character, I did spend a lot of time in libraries reading fairy stories. And I always chose them because I thought the pictures were really beautiful. I had like my favorite illustrators, and I always make the librarians find books for me based on my favorite illustrators as opposed to the authors. And so I have, just a lot of strong feelings about making books and writing and examining fairy tales and what they mean to the reader and what they mean to the people who are telling the stories. And so that's sort of the long answer, is that this is something that I've always wanted to do and a story that I've always kind of wanted to tell. And the shorter answer is that it was my very first my very first go at a graphic novel, and I wasn't sure when I would get another opportunity. So I was like, how can I tell as many of my favorite stories as possible in one book? So I gathered all of my favorite fairy tales together and was like, okay, what is the interesting thing that kind of makes all of these things click for me emotionally? And so that was kind of how I chose the fairy tales and threaded them together.
I absolutely love that. I also love the idea that you were like, this would probably be my one go. And it's like, of course it's not Tron.
Right.
I mean, we'll talk more about future Trung projects later,
right.
But I just kind of love how it all came together and your idea behind this. I would love to talk a little bit about the process. So you had an idea, you had kind of multiple ideas of what you would like to do with this book. But like, how in the process of it all did it become the graphic novel that we all know and love? So I kind of wanted to call out specific stages, because like Gina Gagliano, who's the publisher for Random House Graphic, acquired the book. And once all the business aspect stuff was done, what was your first step?
Well, it's hard to say exactly what a first step is, because this project has sort of existed in different iterations before. So it started as sort of like a short zine thing where I was like, here are some concept drawings that I did for this thing that I wish were a story. And I did like a little gallery show of it. And so a lot of the visual aspects of it kind of came together before, but the moment that it actually became a book was when I wrote an outline, and then we cleaned it up and sent it in. And that's when I was like, oh, okay, so there is narrative cohesion. There's a beginning, a middle, and an end. There are characters that I care about that are starting to reveal themselves to me. I think I was partway through the scripting process after I nailed down the outline, and the book was already sold. So I was already working with Gina, and I think also you at the time, and I was writing it. And I was like, oh, the characters are starting to surprise me with their personalities and their priorities and their interests. And that was when I was like, okay, so this is a real book now.
No, I absolutely love that. I mean, I know that. So when I came into edit The Magic Fist, you were already in the, you had the outline was working, and we were working on scripting and thumbnails, and you had a very unique process of how you were bringing things together, because you had like ideas, and then we would kind of rearrange things as we were like working on it together. And so for me personally, I'm curious about like, what stage did you feel confident about the story that you were bringing together? Because like me coming in, I saw it and I was like, this is beautiful and it's going to be amazing, and I can't wait for like the world to see this. But I wonder if you always had that feeling, kind of like how I felt whenever I got to come into this book, or at like what stage were you confident in the book? Now I'm asking like if you were ever confident in the book, like.
Okay, I think the point at which I realized that the story was starting to gel, I think it was after the thumbnailing stage. I was already starting to draw the pages, and I was drawing things traditionally at first. And so I would be like, penciling and then inking and then erasing and then scanning. And then like cleaning it up, and it was taking a lot of time. And then I switched over to digital later. But partway through the traditional portion of it, I realized that, like, at the very beginning, when I was writing the script, I wasn't sure if I was going to be a very good comic book writer, because as someone who kind of comes from the art end of things, I assumed a couple of very wrong things. First of all, that I'm a visually oriented person, which I am to a great extent, because I am an artist and I think visually. And also that I thought that I knew what was a great way to write for an artist, right? Because I'd worked with writers before, and I've been very spoiled because they're all, very, very talented, very skilled people. And so I would get a script and I'd be like, oh, okay, everything makes a lot of sense. And then, so I had all of these ideas in my brain about like how I would be an ideal writer for an artist, and how I would be able to gel visually with someone's, visual aesthetics, and be able to communicate complex visual ideas in very particular ways. And then I wrote the thing, and then I started drawing the thing, and then I looked back on the script and I was like, I don't know what my writer self was thinking, because my writer self and my artist self are two totally different people. And we apparently don't have the same ideas about what makes a great story. And it does take a long time to get from the scripting process to the drawing process. So by the time I got to the drawing process, I was like, I don't know what this writer is talking about. I don't know what he was thinking at all. But the part where I kind of felt like the story was finally coming together was when I could look at the script and have a really clear idea, like, oh, like I remember at this point in the process, I became much more confident in my abilities to convey my own ideas to myself. So as soon as the drawing process became really smooth, as soon as I could look at a script and be like, oh, okay, so this makes a lot of sense, I sort of understood how I could best work together with myself. And that was when I kind of felt like, okay, so this is finally something that came together. So all of the pieces, everything, the story beats were in order. We did a little bit of rearranging, but it didn't really feel like I had to change very much. And so the point at which I kind of felt like actually everything is set in a way that makes sense is when the drawing made sense to me.
No, I love that. So side question, who do you think is more organized, the writer you or the artist you? Like, who do you think has it more together?
Oh gosh, the artist me, 100%, because writer me is just a disaster. I would write a script and then I would be so like, I mean, I think honestly, it's just because I'm more experienced as an artist than I am as a writer. And so I know all of the tricks to make myself, put a story down on a page in terms of the composition. But as a writer, I'm just overwhelmed with possibility all of the time, like partly because it's the first part of the process. I need the script to be done first before I can understand where the visuals are going. But also I'm just less experienced at it. So there's a lot more room for growth. And so there's also a lot more room for doubt in that process. And so I'm trying to edit out ideas that are extraneous and that don't make a lot of sense. By the time I'm drawing things, I know exactly where things need to go. So I think my artist self is much, much more organized.
Well, I think you can say that both of them should be very confident in what they're doing, because everyone is very happy with this book and loves it so much. Kind of the final part of the process of like putting this book together was working with our senior designer, Patrick Prodi. And I know he was very vital to like helping figure out the color scheme and the overall like design of the book. What was it like working with a designer as someone who's so visually like involved as you are both the writer and the artist of this book?
I mean, a big thing that I learned working with a designer, and Patrick is amazing. I love his work. He did a lot of work with Piao Press before, and I loved a lot of the mini comics that they put out. And so I was familiar with his work, and I really liked the way that he puts projects together. And so I was really confident in his capacity to make the book really beautiful. And the one thing that I really took away from it is that my skills in terms of drawing are not design skills. Drawing, illustrating, totally different skill set than design. Like they're both kind of visually oriented, but a graphic designer is an entirely different tool set than I'm familiar with. So I would not know, I wouldn't know up from down when it comes to designing a book. So I'm so happy that Patrick was on it. I also work with a flatter, Robin, who I credited in the book. And that made the process so much smoother, because I am not someone who's terribly confident in terms of coloring things, and I needed things to be sort of simplified for me. And so working with a flatter was really excellent for that. And then kind of getting to talk with Patrick about the design of the book was a process that I'd never really gone through before. And it was so kind of thoughtful in the ways that, like, he designed the the text as well. He designed the font that was used, and that was also challenging because Vietnamese is a tonal language, and so there are a lot of diacritical marks that needed to be crafted in order for all of the text to look exactly the way that it needed to. And he did such a lovely job, not understanding any of the language and just kind of going by the notes I gave him, like, okay, this mark needs to go here, and these are the letters that need to exist. So it was kind of a unique process where he wasn't just kind of a designer, but he was also making sure that the book was culturally from a space that was really authentic to me.
Yeah, I think y'all both did an amazing job together because, I mean, I'm sure everyone does because the book's just beautiful. And I love hearing about this because I was always kind of curious about, like, now that you've had time to step away from it all, like how the process worked, at least from like your end of things, because like everyone is like, oh, well, I'm involved with the process. So I know from editorially how things went, which I thought were fantastic because I just really love how this book came together and I loved working with you. And so kind of moving on from the process and talking more about the book itself, you've commented before about how the book ended up heavier than you originally intended. Why do you think that?
Oh my gosh. So in rereading the book, I got to the back matter because I had a very clear idea of what I wanted the book to be. And after I finished making the book, I sort of wrote a little essay that we put together at the end. And I'd had a lot of time to sort of like think about things. And one of the things that I said was that I observed that oftentimes when people tell difficult stories, we kind of like to hold things at arm's length. So we intellectualize things and we kind of make things nice and neat so that we don't have to deal quite so much with the emotional impact of things. And I fully didn't realize that was what I was doing the entire time. And so I never felt while I was writing or while I was drawing it, that it was an especially emotionally hefty book. Certainly there were moments where I was like, okay, so this emotional beat works and it works for this reason. And so I could sort of pick at it and think about it on sort of this very minute level. And then my experience with it as a reader was totally different because I had to experience the emotional beats kind of in my heart instead of in my brain. Yeah, and so I evidently dragged myself completely already in the back matter of the book. I could correctly identified that I was holding a topic that held a lot of emotional resonance for me at arm's length by making it sort of intellectualized or making it a craft thing or making it something that wasn't so personal all of the time. And so if I could pretend that it's not personal, I could go through and spend a ton of time with it. And then, you know, part of a year later, I actually read the thing and suddenly it was emotionally resonant. I was like, oh, okay, I see what happened here.
Well, it's kind of amazing to be able to tell a story where even if you are holding it at arm's length, that it does resonate with so many people, like even yourself whenever you reread it, but like to have that authentic feeling still come through, even though as you're actively creating it, you kind of have to separate yourself because you don't you don't want to be crying, like sobbing as you're drawing every single page because it's like emotionally, you know, you're so emotionally connected. But it's also one of those things being like, I understand the need for that arm's length, but I also think that it just shows how special this book is, that even with you doing that while you're creating it, you were able to create something that still resonated so authentically and so genuinely with such a wide audience. And you know, so I kind of love that aspect of how it came together. Yeah. So kind of moving on from that, the story's core relationship is between Tien and his mom Helen. Why did it feel important to add those pieces of Helen's story? And how does Tien come back? And how does that come back to Tien's struggle of coming out?
Well, I think one of the things that was pretty important to me in terms of making sure that the story beats came together was to flesh out the relationship between those two. And I wanted the story to kind of have two protagonists. It isn't like it's ostensibly a coming out story and it is an immigrant story about a young boy, but I wanted to make sure that the important pieces in his life came together in a meaningful way. And I couldn't do that without making sure that the reader knew about what his family life looked like and where Helen came from as well. I think a lot of the, I guess, the themes of the book kind of center around grace quite a bit, about really exploring things when you're not really sure exactly the right way to do things. And I think it's one of those stories where, you know, the characters have their priorities, but things shift suddenly because life happens. And no matter how hard you're trying, things will get in the way. You will find that your language is insufficient, and language oftentimes evolves, and it evolves away from you if you're out of practice. And so there's that sense of this huge cavernous emotional heft where you're missing something, and you know that it's, you know, that things are happening and time is kind of moving on in a space that you don't really exist, and it's growing away from you. And so Helen feeling that really strongly, and then Tien also really wanting to emotionally connect with his mother, that was something that I wanted to make sure came through. And so Helen's story became much, much more important as I was writing it, because I realized that it was really necessary to kind of flesh out her growth as a character. And I think one of the things that surprised me about the process of storytelling is that Tien is like, he's a 13-year-old kid. And so I sort of took for granted that he's going to grow. And I didn't need to show him at a moment where he was experiencing an enormous amount of growth. He's very sure about what he wants, and he knows that he wants to communicate this thing. He knows who his friends are. And so in a lot of ways, he's very secure in his attachments to his friends and to his parents. He just has to figure out exactly what's, you know, what the right way to go about expressing this thing to his parents is. And so there's not a ton of fear and anxiety in rejection in this coming out story. It was more about like making sure that his family understood, and then that sort of like fear of rejection. And the story kind of takes place in the 90s, is something that comes up a little bit later when an antagonist kind of introduces the idea into his mind. And so that's kind of when the relationship, like a little bit of insecurity comes into Tien's focus. But with Helen, her arc is much, much stronger. She's at a place in her life where she's been through quite a lot of things. And so for her to kind of continue to seek opportunities to grow, to make sure that the world is a good place for her son, I thought was something that was really resonant for me and much more impactful. And so I think her piece of the story became incredibly important for me to tell.
No, I mean, I agree 100%, because I feel like their relationship just, and what they were each going through individually, just works so well to like parallel each other's story, even though their stories deal with very different things going on in each other. Like, even though they're related and they're sharing each other's lives, their lives are going through two different paths. And I thought you did such a good job with that. I do have a curious question about Tien's father, because he's
Sure.
kind of like a background character in the story, but he clearly is like loving and accepting and like supports his son and loves his wife. But you don't really get to see his like interaction with the family or his interaction with Tien. Is there anything that you would have liked to have added with his character at the end of the story, or is there any way that you see that he would have reacted to like Tien coming out, like his mother, you know, changed the story so that she could show that she approved? Was it the same with the father?
I think I don't know that I paid that much attention to the development of Tien's father, like as a character, but I kind of always had a really strong idea of who he was. And so I think I sort of took that for granted. And so it showed up in the script that way. But I think one of the things that I really wanted to kind of push back on in terms of immigrant narratives and coming out narratives is oftentimes there's a fear of like this kind of paternalistic force in the home that would make things very difficult. And I didn't want that to be kind of the primary, like I didn't want that to hold a lot of gravity in this book. And so from the get, I was certain that Helen was going to be the parent figure with the most agency and with the most growth. And so the story beats that have to do with Tien's father, they're all kind of within the context of his relationship to Helen. And so he's kind of there in a way to kind of add a little bit of texture to the relationship between Tien and Helen. And he's not so much a character that I was interested in fleshing out kind of on his own, because that's a story that I've heard quite a lot kind of growing up, is that everything in terms of like coming out stories and in terms of immigrant narratives are all about like kind of like father-son relationships. And I think those are very important, but at the same time, I really wanted this book in particular to center on a maternal relationship.
Yeah, I think that makes total sense. And I absolutely love that. I have a few more questions, so don't worry, but I did want to shout out to our audience here that if they have any questions, feel free to start putting it in the Q&A button, and we'll get to whatever we can at the end. But on with my questions. So the book also centers around fairy tales. Can you talk about the process and purpose of using fairy tales to weave within the stories of being told by Tien and Helen?
Sure. So fairy tales are something that I kind of love going through over and over. I've read the same stories, I think, like dozens and dozens and dozens of times in different iterations. And it's something that I really enjoy doing because I really believe that storytelling is a relationship that develops between the storyteller and whoever is listening to or reading the story. And so it reveals a lot about the storyteller. And so it almost doesn't matter what the content of the story is. Like that's obviously really important, but I am really interested in where the author is coming from, where that voice comes from. I like to imagine like the world that the storyteller inhabits and why their priorities develop the way that they do. And fairy tales were kind of the way that I would do that as a kid. I would read stories and they would start off like once upon a time in a land very far away. And it was an opportunity for me to exercise this empathetic imagination, to to envision things that I had never seen before and to empathize with characters going through things that I had never gone through in my entire life and couldn't imagine, actually going through myself. And so I chose fairy stories that were oftentimes that were very similar or had some comparisons, in order to showcase the relevance that they kind of had to different characters with different points of view. They're drawn in very specific kind of visual aesthetics as well. And so they're kind of drawn from the visual imagination of each of the storytellers. And so I wanted to tell kind of all of the fairy tales that were sort of important to me, but also make sure that I drew comparisons to them so that the reader gets a good sense for why they matter to whoever it is that's telling the story, since that's the primary mode of communication between the main characters. And so the first two stories are different iterations of a Cinderella story, and those are, kind of pretty common, and we have ideas about what they look like in the popular imagination. And I wanted to challenge that a little bit and kind of turn it on its head and compare two different stories that had a lot of familiar story beats, but maybe weren't the most popular Cinderella stories. And telling the Vietnamese version of Cinderella was something that I had always wanted to do, in terms of telling, a graphic story or a comic book. And so that was very exciting for me. And the Little Mermaid, there's actually two different Little Mermaid stories that are happening at the same time, because the characters are participating in a ballet that is also an iteration of the Little Mermaid. So it's just like a couple of different, it's a little tiramisu of the Little Mermaid. And that one I chose for its pertinence as sort of a story of transition that can be read as an allegory for queerness, in particular having to do with Hans Christian Andersen's history. But it's also a story about immigration, about sacrificing your voice and your agency in order to be someplace with the person that you love. And I think that kind of has a lot of kind of tiered and layered emotional resonance with a lot of different readers. So that's sort of the gist of why I chose those stories and how I decided to weave them together.
I mean, I love them, and you illustrated them so beautifully. Kind of like a side question on this is, do you have a favorite? Like, now that you've gotten to illustrate multiple versions and all this stuff, do you have like a favorite one that you've got to illustrate, or a favorite moment that you got to illustrate with these fairy tales?
I do not, because I drew them all in different ways for different reasons that all happen to be kind of my favorite things. So the very first Cinderella is drawn from the visual imagination of Tien. And so I was like, oh, okay, so I grew up consuming a lot of media just like this kid. And so I so I could draw from my own kind of very sentimental childhood images. And so that was really fun for me. And then the Vietnamese Cinderella, I got to do a lot more research. I got to understand like why the ao dai looks the way that it does and what the history of that garment is. And I got to look at what Vietnam looked like before the Vietnam War, because a lot of our visual imagination in the US, in the West, a lot of our kind of images of Vietnam kind of come from that time. And there's a rich history and, the aesthetic inclinations of the world that people living in Vietnam inhabited before the wars is just so rich and so interesting. And I'd never seen a lot of those images before. So that was a really wonderful thing for me to experience as a Vietnamese American diasporic person. And the last story, The Little Mermaid, I I drew because I had been going on a John Hughes movie marathon. And so I watched kind of all of those old like teen rom-coms, and I was really sort of fascinated with the texture of this, like with this sort of imaginary world to me. That I had only ever seen kind of like in film. And so I was really kind of fascinated with that aesthetic and these were the movies that a character like Helen would have experienced. Like this is the media that she would have seen that would have made her inclined to want to come to the United States in particular. And this would have been her window to that culture. And so I imagine that this would be, this would have some influence on the ways that she saw the world. So they were all, I don't have a favorite. I loved doing each of them for different reasons.
I absolutely love that. Yeah, that's amazing. Well, now I'm going to put you on the spot. So you were GLAAD Media Award nominated, Lammy nominated, Eisner nominated, British Fantasy Award nominated, 5-star reviews. The response has been amazing. That has to feel good, right? And kind of like, what has been your reaction to all the praise that the Magic Fish just continues to get?
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Whitney. I'm still like, I'm someone who's not very good at taking compliments. And so these are all like, okay, so these have all been dished out in very formal channels. And so I got to, you know, like, and all of this is taking place remotely as well. And so I get to sort of selectively like feel my feelings about them. And so it feels nice. And I'm like, not, they're not things that I thought about when I don't think it's ever a writer's goal to like be nominated for awards. And so this wasn't something that I ever thought about. So every award nomination kind of came as like this really pleasant surprise, like, oh, this is really wonderful. What a lovely first experience. And then I'm a little nervous now because I'm like, oh, okay, what if my sophomore slump comes in real soon? But it's exciting, and I'm so happy that it's a story that really seemed to resonate with so many people.
Yeah, I mean, it really has resonated with so many people, and I mean, really people of all ages, because I feel like you've gotten a chance to talk with like a younger audiences and older audiences. What has been one of your favorite reactions from a reader, or has anything stood out?
Sure. There were a lot of things within the fairy tales that I completely took for granted that I just put there because I knew the fairy tales really well. And so one of my favorite parts about kind of this book in particular, it's ostensibly written for a YA audience, but I don't really think about books in that way. I read a lot of books that were above and below kind of my reading level and age range, depending on what I was interested at the moment at any given point in my relationship with the library. And so I never really thought about, or I didn't think too hard about the age ranges. And so I would get to have a lot of conversations with, you know, much younger readers and adult readers as well. And one of the best questions I think I ever got was from a middle schooler who was wondering about a particular detail of one of the very first fairy tales, because that story is an amalgamation, that Cinderella story is an amalgamation of a lot of different fairy tales. And there's a detail in it where the mother character who disappears gets struck 3 times. And it's a reference to an Irish story about selkies and this sort of curse where a man would steal a selkie skin and the selkie would be bound to marry him, but she would be able to return to the sea if he struck her 3 times. And so there's a story. And so that was something that really stuck with me when I was little, because I remembered that because my parents also kind of were very intentional about discussing, you know, what appropriate behaviors are in relationships between family members. And so they would observe a lot of domestic abuse in the places where they grew up. And so those were stories that were always things that kind of stuck out in my mind, like, oh, like this is a thing that happens. It's a part of my imagination that there is sometimes danger in the home. And if that And if that danger arises, it's appropriate to leave. And so when I read the Selkie myth as a very small child, I was like, oh, okay, yeah, absolutely. She should leave him if he strikes her. And that was a detail that I included in the story that I don't really get to talk about, but a very young reader picked up on it right away and asked me about it. And I was like, oh, this is such a wonderfully observant thing to ask me, because I had completely taken that part of the story for granted. It was just a part of the texture of this particular fairy tale. And getting to kind of think about it and explain it to a reader was a really lovely thing that I didn't think I would get to do.
I love the idea that something that like resonated with you when you were a younger reader, then and you put it in as future stories now resonating with younger readers of today. So it's kind of like carrying on
Yeah.
this story element that really that clearly that has clearly stuck with you all these years. I think that's amazing. So now that we've talked about the magic fish and how amazing you are and how amazing this book is there anything you want to share about some other projects you have going on, and any scripts coming through that I should be excited about?
So I mean, you know, when the script due date is, so I'm working very hard on scripting my second graphic novel with you and Random House Graphic, and I'm super excited about it because it's just going to be kind of this fun story that I wanted to do kind of as a cool down from the Magic Fish, which was so emotionally hefty. And so I'm writing a pastiche of another fairy tale that's sort of set in contemporary times, so we'll see how that goes. It's a totally different mode of writing than I'm used to. Every mode of writing is different than I'm used to because I've never written anything before the Magic Fish. So I'm just really excited to explore the possibilities of storytelling in my next book. And it does kind of have a fairy tale analog, but it sort of moves away from it a little bit more. It's not quite so tightly wound as the Magic Fish, so I'm very excited about that. I've been buying a bunch of visual reference books because I'm learning about about, I guess, like Norwegian and like Swedish American aesthetics, and kind of like it's a very aesthetically Minnesotan book, and so I have a lot of strong sentimental feelings about like, oh, like these are the places that I love, and these are the places that I was familiar with growing up. And so we don't have a title for it yet, but it's about a girl who gets an internship at her local puppet theater, and through some and she messes up at some point and she has to go about fixing all of the mistakes that she's made, and she sort of develops stronger relationships with her peers for it and with her parents for it. I'm really excited about it. And kind of in the interim, I've been doing a few kind of like superhero comics as well. I did a stint doing a few short DC comics, and that was really fun as well because superheroes was something that I never thought that I would ever do. I didn't think that my aesthetic was appropriate for them, and they found a space for me, and I had a lot of fun. And yeah, so those are all of the things. So I did like a Wonder Woman that'll be coming out later this year, Aquaman's 80th anniversary. I did a very short Green Lantern one and a short Batwoman comic as well for different anthologies.
I will have to say, as a fan of Batwoman, it was very exciting to see you illustrating the character.
Oh, that makes me so happy.
Yeah, I was very like whenever you first posted, I was just like, "What is this?" And then I was just excited. So, just a little sidetrack. But so that was all of my questions. But we do have a question from the audience, and it's a question for your illustrator side.
Sure.
Was your writer's POV something that carried on into your other projects, or was it something unique to the Magic Fish?
I think it's something that was unique to the Magic Fish. The writing process for that, I hewed very closely to my comfort zone in the things that I'd written before. And the last long form thing that I had written was literally an essay for college. And so I structured it a lot like an essay. And so the ways that I approached the storytelling kind of aesthetically were all things that I came up so there are a lot of common threads to the way that I draw. Like I have a very particular aesthetic, but the visual approaches that I used for drawing each parts of the story were things that I sort of made up along the way. And so I don't have anything particularly set in stone. I don't have a lot of strong illustrative habits in terms of long form storytelling just yet, since this is my very first long form project. So I haven't developed like artistic habits just yet. I'm still sort of learning. So I don't know Yeah, so I don't know if I have like I don't have an accurate assessment of like what my process is like for that, or like what my habits are, but that's sort of like how I developed things visually and narratively. I don't know how well that answered that question.
I mean, but I think that's how it works. As you're, especially the graphic, like you've said, the Magic Fish was your first graphic novel, was your first long form project, and was also your first time writing a long form project.
Yeah.
So I feel like there's such a learning curve, but it's a learning curve that's going to follow you from project to project to project. Because I mean, I know people who have been publishing for, you know, a long time, who are still working on the way that they do things and the way that they put stuff together. So it's just exciting to get to see your process at the very beginning of it all, and then get to, you know, continue working with you as you continue developing what your process actually ends up going to be.
Yeah, I think
so-
that's a better way to sum up the like my answer to that question is like, I'm also excited to find out like what this looks like for me.
we're all just excited. So that was it for the questions. But before I let everyone go, I wanted to ask you if you had any book recommendations for anyone who enjoyed the Magic Fish, or any books that you've read recently that you just really enjoyed that you want to share with the audience.
Oh gosh.
Or is it all like Norwegian architecture?
I've just been doing a lot of research. I don't know how to read for fun anymore, so it's hard for me to actually like go and read kind of like new books. But one of a book series that I'm really enjoying is called Gesh by Alexis Deakin. It's spelled Geis, and it's drawn in such a beautiful, like kind of Punch and Judy illustrated style. It's so beautiful and so lush. And I love it a lot. Any and all of Tilly Walden's books are amazing. So read all of them. A lot of them are webcomics too, so you can read them for free, but I love having like a physical volume of those books. There is a book called Stages of Rot by, I don't know if I'm pronouncing her name right, but the artist is Linnea Sterti, I think, and it's Sterte. And it's a science fiction graphic novel that has very few words in it. It's mostly visual, and it's this sort of like fictionalized account of almost like evolution over the course of the story. And it's about like the life cycle of like this particular being and its relationship to the people around it and the environment around it. And so it's just this really lovely meditation on the process of existing and then passing away from existence and then kind of coming back. So it's just it's a lovely and poetic book that's a difficult read if you're not used to comic book storytelling, but it's so beautiful. I would recommend it to everybody.
I 100% agree. Stages of, like you brought up Stages of Rot, and I was like, that is by far one of my favorite Piao books. So I was like,
yes, it's so beautiful.
I absolutely love it. Well, it is time for us to wrap things up. So thank you, Trung, and thank you everyone who tuned in. You can also check out future virtual events from the Virginia Festival of Book at vabook.org. And, you know, just thank you all. And it's been a pleasure getting to talk with all of you.